So the 1920s was Radio Corporation of America. It was a lot like today's Google. You know, it was cutting-edge technology. They had this idea that you could put radios in cars. Imagine that.
The American investing public began to connect the products they were using that were coming from corporate America with the notion that, hey, I might own a share of the company that makes that product that I like.
I'd have to see my broker, find out what he can do, 'cause I'm in the mall, get for you all sweet little.
By the mid-20s, around 3 million Americans were in the market, and Wall Street gripped the public imagination. With tales of fortunes being made overnight, the idea of a great bull market, where shares only seemed to go up, took hold.
Every popular magazine, every newspaper, every radio station was fascinated by what was going on in the stock market. People charted the activities of celebrities like Charlie Chaplin or Groucho Marx and were fascinated by what stocks they happened to be speculating in.
The young comic actor Groucho Marx invested all his savings into the market and was so pleased with his profits on paper that he persuaded his brothers to invest too.
What an easy racket. RCA went up 7 points since this morning. I just made myself $7,000.
But it wasn't just celebrities becoming speculators. The big Wall Street speculators were becoming celebrities themselves. They were thought of as creative, entrepreneurial, and bringing wealth to America. Joseph Kennedy, father of the future President Kennedy, was one of this new breed of shrewd financial superstar.
People were fascinated because some of these men, like Joseph Kennedy, were ordinary folks. They were men from nowhere, and their rapid rise on the market was a kind of inspiration to ordinary folk that might even be possible for them someday.
Stories circulated that anyone from bellboys to barbers could make easy money on the market. A shoeshine boy on Wall Street, Pat Bologna was one of those inspired by these tales of rags to riches.
Everyone was going to make a fortune. If you lived in New York, the stock market was king. My father was probably about 17 or 18. On a daily basis, he would shine the shoes of the great men of America. People like Joseph Kennedy, executives like Mitchell. He would converse with them and became somewhat of an expert on things like the Federal Reserve and things that you wouldn't think that a shoeshine would be expert on. But he was talking to the great minds of Wall Street every day, all day. And so my father began to invest in the stock market. If the truth be told, I learned how to reading the stock pages. Because that was what my father did. I mean, we grew up with the stock market. There was the stock market for breakfast. There was the stock market for dinner when he came home. The stock market was the world.
I started in 1928 because, like many young people, I wanted to go to the place where everybody was making all this money. My first job was to be a messenger boy on the floor of the exchange. It took only a week or two to find out that most of the time people are greedy.
People had so much faith in the bull market that they borrowed increasing sums of money to speculate on rising share prices. This way of buying shares was known as buying on margin. The investor was required to put down only part of the money, with their broker funding the rest. The culture of buy now, pay later had spread to the stock market.
Buying stocks on margin means essentially that you're buying them with borrowed money. By the late 1920s, 90% of the purchase price of the stock is being made with borrowed money.
There were no rules about how much you could borrow, and people borrowed enormous sums of money to buy stocks. You could buy a $100 stock for $25, and then the brokerage firm would loan you the other $75. And if the stock went up, and in the late 20s, everything seemed to go up and up, then that $25 could turn into investment that was worth $200 or $300. So it became a huge part of the U.S. economy to loan money for the stock market. In fact, in the late 1920s, nearly 40 cents of every dollar loaned was for stocks.
This vast influx of borrowed money into the stock market created more demand for shares, pushing prices ever upwards. In 1928, the market went up by almost 50% in just 12 months. And as stocks continued to rise, more and more investors borrowed money to get a piece of the action. One of them was shoeshine boy Pat Bologna.
My father didn't have a lot of money in the stock market. He told me at the time he had about $6,000 in cash. But remember, $6,000 in cash translated into a lot of stock because in those years you only had to put 10% down for margin. So with $6,000 you could have $60,000 worth of stock.
Wall Street was hungry for new punters. There was one group of would-be investors that the street had always ignored, but whose money it now wanted.
Up until the 1920s, women had played a very small role in the stock market. Part of this was simply gender prejudice. They were considered incapable of the kind of cool sang-froid was necessary if you speculated in the market. But in the 20s, part of the popularization of the stock market included huge numbers of women.
Well, the 20s were a big time for women anyway. They really stepped out on their own. They began to take control of their own money. They went to college, actually, in record numbers in the 1920s. And as they did that, they also got interested in the stock market and as a way for them to build their own wealth.
One such investor was a pioneering New York photographer called Alice Austin. She lived on Staten Island, just across the water from Wall Street.
She had moved into this house when she was a couple of months old. She was bright, she was adventurous. By the time she was 11, she had received a camera, which was a new invention by the time, and she immediately took to it. Over the years, she took some 8,000 glass plate negatives, making her one of America's earliest and most prolific photographers.
Alice's inheritance from her grandfather had funded a comfortable lifestyle, but it had dwindled by the 1920s, and she was tempted by Wall Street's promise of a quick buck.
So Alice Austin discovers that she's running a little low, and the question then becomes what to do. Her friends urged her to be conservative, cut some spending, maybe not go to Europe, maybe not buy a car. Instead, Alice found a broker who advised her no, buy stocks, become rich quick. And you know what? You can borrow money so you can buy even more stocks, buying on margin. And Alice Austin thought that, hey, sounds like a good idea to me.
Throughout the soaring market of the 1920s, the Republican Party stayed in power on the back of America's increasing prosperity. Calvin Coolidge became president in 1923. An investor himself, he was notably silent on the speculative mania gripping Wall Street.
Calvin Coolidge typifies the laissez-faire, devil-may-care recklessness of the 1920s. He's famous for saying that the business of America is business.
It was a prosperous period. Business was making money. Wall Street was making money. The politicians, I think, just said, well, everything's fine. The economy's growing. The market takes care of things pretty well, and the government's job is to get out of the way.
During the Coolidge presidency, Wall Street's power continued to grow unchecked. His administration had close links with an elite group of bankers and financiers, Wall Street's inner circle. Their wealth and connections gave them immense influence over the government's financial policy.
They were small, elite, private partnerships. This was really the royalty of Wall Street. These were very mysterious and discreet places. They were small firms with limited capital, but they exercised really an outsized power.
The most prestigious of these elite firms was the J.P. Morgan Bank. Strategically located directly opposite the stock exchange, it would play a key role in events to come. As senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Thomas Lamont was the most powerful man on Wall Street. His influence extended well beyond